Dr. Vanessa, do I call you Dr. Vanessa? Do I call you Dr. V? Do I call you Vanessa? Just let's get it over and done with straight up.
I answer to all those things. Just don't go calling me Dr. Lapointe because it feels way too stuffy.
Done. I think, as I mentioned, a moment ago before we started recording, we down here, we kind of barely speak English, let alone French. So I think you're good with that.
Perfect.
So thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I guess, I'd like to know a little bit straight off the bat in terms of your story. I mean, I'd love to know why you got into this journey to begin with, why you became a registered, child psychologist or a psychologist, why you kind of took the pathway that you did.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things where I always had a pull from a very young age to work with children. I didn't know in what capacity, and I didn't ultimately know where it was that would end up taking me, but I always knew that I would work with children. And so my very first jobs were, day camp leader and doing summer camps and teaching figure skating lessons and doing all of these kinds of things with children. And then as I got into high school and was getting closer to that time where I needed to figure out what that was all going to look like when I grew up, I got more interested in psychology. And ultimately, I ended up almost failing out of my first year of university. True story. And decided it was time. I was doing a science degree and it wasn't really going the way that I'd hoped. I wasn't on fire about it. And so I needed to switch gears. And I ended up in a biological psychology program with a really big focus on sort of neuroscience and how the brain goes and grows. And I was completely fascinated and did the deep dive down the rabbit hole of the world of psychology, and then was able to put that together in terms of some graduate work around working with children, and ended up in the field of psychology. And so that's what got me there. And I started my career and thought I knew it all, and then became a mother. And I was like, what? All of this stuff that they taught me is, a big sack of lies. None of it works. These kids don't make sense. I felt like the axis of my whole earth had shifted and I needed to learn it all anew. And so I really have, very humbly walked the journey of being both a mother and a psychologist. My boys are now 13 and 16, and it hasn't been a straight line. It's been wonderful, and it's come with big, gorgeous peaks and really, really deep, dark valleys. And so, to figure that all out for myself as a parent and be really, truly honored to walk along other parents as they figure their journey out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. I mean, I think that word just, humility, that's a really important one, huh? I feel like for me especially, it's kind of one big journey of realizing how kind of selfish you are in a sense.
Yeah, and how not grown up we are.
Yeah.
We become adults, but we're really just children walking around in adult bodies. And then we have children, and like the spotlight lands on that.
Yeah, 100%. And I love the fact that, so much of what I see in your work, a lot of it is focused, on us as parents. I feel like, I almost kind of went, should they be called a child psychologist or a parent psychologist? That's kind of how it feels a little bit, because, I'll let you be the judge of that, but we know that that's huge, right? I mean, children are children, and children are complex, and they're different, and they're amazing, and, but we are the ones ultimately that are kind of steering that ship to a degree.
Absolutely. I'm a child psychologist, and I don't work with children.
Yeah.
So sometimes I do observations and am involved in assessments, but the work to be done is with the parent. And I'm always very careful to say it's not because you necessarily have caused any of the challenges that your child may be facing, but rather that you are definitely the answer to those challenges. And I say to parents, listen, you can send your kid to see me an hour a week, and we
Yeah.
might as well take your money and burn it and take your time and just discard it, because then your child comes home to you and marinates in the environment of your home,
Yeah.
your relationship with your child. You
Yeah.
are the one ultimately 24/7 that is making their world go round, and that is moving the pieces in the child's world, in their environment, in order to be best suited to that child's developmental journey. And so really the power lies with the parent. And we would be, I think, very well served to honor parents in that, to champion parents in that, and to allow children to just get to rest into the care of the parent.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I think it's huge, like I've been a father for 6 years. Noah, our oldest, just turned 6, and Olive, our little girl, is 2. And, it's been an amazing ride for both myself and Alice, my wife. And I think that, I feel, I've been fortunate enough to have a great life and had some adventures and done a lot of cool stuff with work and, seen a lot of the world. But I really feel like being a father is, without doubt the highest mandate, that exists on planet Earth. And I also feel like it's crazy because it's while it's the highest mandate, it's also kind of like you get the least amount of training for, you get the least amount of preparation for, right?
That's right. And it'll bring you to your knees.
100%. 100%. And so what is that? I mean, that you've probably just given it to me, but I kind of wanted to ask a little bit in terms of like, for people who aren't familiar with your work, what is your what could you kind of give us a little bit about your philosophy, your why, your reasoning?
Yeah. Yeah. And so the way that I sort of think through all of that is there really are a couple of layers that we have to be considering. Without question, the idea that the parent-child relationship is central to healthy child development. At this point, in terms of the science of child development, that is an irrefutable fact. So the thing that makes it happen for kids is when they have deep, caring relationship with at least one big person in their life, usually a parent. And so that's, we can call it attachment, or we can call it connection, or we can call it whatever we want to call it. But that is a really, really big piece of making sure that it goes exactly as it needs to go for that child to actualize into their fullest potential. The second big piece is development, that we have to get how it works. We have to get that 25% of 2-year-olds are going to bite. Not because they're rotten little
Yeah.
so-and-sos, but because that's just sort of where they're at, and it's
Yeah.
how they're regulating and making sense of their world.
Yeah.
And we don't need to make them wrong for that. We also don't then just let them, chew on all of the other children. We figure out how to put boundaries in place, and we do it with heart and with compassion, rather than punishing, shaming, or blaming the child. Further along the idea of development, 4-year-olds don't share. 9-year-olds turn into 4-year-olds when you ask them to do something and they really had their heart set on something else. I have a 16-year-old. He's very, very lovely. And I will tell you that teenagers sometimes turn into 4-year-olds when they're up against the wall and life gets really hard and they're very overwhelmed by all of that. And so the first was to understand that relationship is everything for the growing child. The second is to, as big people, really get that child development's a real thing. They're not miniature adults, and we have to come alongside them exactly where they're at. The third thing is what I refer to as consciousness, or conscious parenting, which is to understand that when you were a child, the environment around you created your mind, particularly across the first 6 to 8 years of life. So whatever environment you grew in, it formed your mind. It actually was the driving force behind the neural architecture of your brain, and the driving force behind the emergence of your concept of who you are as a person. So the environment in your childhood formed your mind. Then you grew up and became a parent. And now the mind formed for you in your childhood is forming the environment around you in which your child is now growing. So the environment formed the mind, and then the mind forms the environment, and your children grow in that environment. So you can't just, wash your hands of it and hope for the best. You actually have to rip it open and do the deep dive into who it is that you are, because you will parent as you were parented, even if you swear up and down that you're not going to do that. As soon as your child, and they're here to be our greatest teachers, as soon as you feel the trigger, they punch you in the face, or they throw something, or they hurt their sibling, or they get the greedy gimmies, or whatever they do, and you feel the trigger come up in you. And even if you're really well-intentioned, you will hear your mother or your father come out your mouth. And so then we got to figure out, oh, well, look at that. How are we going to make sense of all of these things? And so it's those three things. Attachment, relationship is everything. Child development is real. And consciousness, you must do your own work. You have to grow you in order to grow them.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I almost don't know where to start. Like there is so much in that. There is so much in those points, and they're all equally, really, really important. And maybe I don't know if I don't know if there is an equal or if they sit on a chain, but they're all very, very important. I definitely want to touch on a lot of those things. I definitely want to touch on, our subconscious programming. I think that's huge, and that's a real kind of part of our journey that we're on at WonderUs. I definitely want to touch, maybe just quickly, you talked, I think in your second point, you talked about expectations. And understanding that children are actually developing. They're not meant to be like born and just like be these fully formed adults that are on our timetable and kind of like on our psyche. And I think, I feel like I personally may have benefited from like reading, Parenting Right from the Start 7 years ago, because we read kind of some other stuff, and I'm not trying to put anyone down or anyone's philosophy down, and everyone's on a journey and everyone, approaches things differently. But our personal stance at the time was kind of around this whole thing of like, your baby should be doing this by this week and this by this week and sleeping through the night by this week, and, some like controlled crying stuff. And, I think back on that and I just go, what, you're just a fool. Like it didn't work. And it was counterproductive. And if anything, it just made us more stressful, because we had all these high expectations on ourselves as young first-time parents.
Right.
And then when things didn't go as it said it should go in the book, it was like, I don't know, man. I think that those expectations, especially for first-time parents that don't really understand and that feel like they do have all this pressure in terms of them having to kind of perform. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And, it's an interesting thing, because we kind of buy into this myth that development isn't real and that children are tiny adults. And if your kid isn't sleeping through the night, or if you have the kid that's the biter, or the kid that won't share, or the kid that's, slow to learn to read at school, or whatever it is, it therefore means that you have done something wrong. And so on the one hand, I listed out those three things as though they're very discrete from one another, but already you can see how layered and sort of messy and murky it gets. Because where is it that we learned we must perform in order to be, deemed as though we're doing this thing called life the right way? We learned that when we were children, and we were being raised by behaviorist parents who were, all of them, the majority of them, very well intentioned, but they would have had to raise us that way because of the times that they were parenting in. And so, we learned very early on that you exchange performance for acceptance. You exchange performance for value. You exchange performance for love. And then we grow up and we have kids and we're like, right, you need to sleep through the night by 6 weeks of age, and you need to do this by this, by this, by this, by this, or I'm failing.
Yeah.
And if I fail, I'm not accepted, I'm not loved, I'm not valued, which makes no sense up here. It's
Mm.
all subconscious programming. And really, when we get right down to it, that subconscious programming is what is running the show for us. It's not up here. It's
Yeah.
all stuff that lurks beneath the surface.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. And like, I think there's a lot of obviously there's been a lot of research into that and a lot of, developments in brain science. And I don't know, I mean, you might be able to correct me on this, but I've heard a lot of different stats, but one of them that I read was, something around 90% of our thought life is subconscious, you know?
Oh, yeah. And I would think that that's probably an underestimate. And so the conscious mind is running at about 2,000 bits per second, and the subconscious mind at about 50 million bits per second. And so it's the subconscious mind that's absolutely in charge. I have this beautiful friend and colleague who she speaks a different language, and I think it must sound way more beautiful in her language, but I will tell you it in English. She said that the longest road that you will ever travel is the one from the head to the heart. And I really think that that's, what this idea is all about in terms of figuring out, like, why is it that we tick the way we do? You know what? I spent 13 years at university studying the science of child development, studying the brain, studying psychology. I mean, I know this field inside and out, backwards and frontwards, up and down. I know all of it. And yet, I yell at my kids sometimes. I get really frustrated with them. I've done all sorts of things where, I think, wow, people actually pay me money to like tell them what to do with their children and check me out now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so why is it that I can have all of the knowledge, but not be able to translate that into my being so that I'm bringing that forward every day, all day into how I do it with my own children? And that's where the real work lies in growing ourselves up. And there's nothing like becoming a parent to be gifted the opportunity yourself to go back in time, have a great childhood, and translate that do-over into how it is that you will now approach the raising of your own children.
Massive, massive. And I mean, I love that. And I love you, being honest and just human enough to kind of to say that as well, because I think it's probably quite releasing for a lot of people, to have all, and I love that quote. And I've heard that quote. I love it. It's such an amazing quote, and it's like having all that head knowledge, and the connection between these two places and how do you make that journey? Like the longest journey someone will ever take is from their head to their heart,
Not for the faint of heart. Let me tell you, if you're going to get on the path and begin the journey, I mean, the payoff, although that vibrates a little bit low, the payoff in all of that is going to be astronomical.
Yeah.
It'll be so worth it. And oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Is it humbling?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And it's healing as well, like we've all got stuff. Like everyone has stuff. It doesn't matter if you were raised in a, mother and father household and there was love, and everyone has stuff, and, I've been doing that personally myself, going on that journey and looking back and, I never had a father. I grew up in a single mom household and, and I'm very grateful in some regards because I think had it been, she stayed with my father, I think it would have been very toxic, a really toxic environment to grow up in. And so, but we all have our things, and it wasn't until becoming a father that I really have kind of entered this journey of going, okay, well, what about that little boy, which was me, 30 years ago? Like, what about that little kid? And is he still around somewhere? And does he need to be kind of spoken to, does he need to be kind of got alongside of? And I actually, and it sounds, that sounds kind of quite spiritual or crazy in a sense, but I love what you say. I love your quote that where all of us are all the ages we've ever been.
That's right.
Like, I think someone could hear that and it would just go straight over their head. They wouldn't think twice about it. But I heard it and I just think that's really profound. Like, can you unpack that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. I envision it a little bit like, the Russian dolls, the Matryoshka doll that has like, the little doll inside the other doll inside the other doll, and you can go on and on and on. And we never ever lose who it was that we were before. And so I'm 45 years old, shocking but true. And inside of me, there's a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old and all of the ages that I've ever been. It never entirely goes away. And what's incredibly important to know about that inner child piece is that in the first 6 to 8 years, when our minds are being formed, it is especially key that we're able to come alongside those parts of ourselves and understand where it was that our needs might not have been met, even if we had the awesomest, most well-intentioned parents, to understand where it is that our needs might not have been met and how that is still alive within us now. And so I'll give you an example. I remember being 5 or 6 years old, and I would crawl into my parents' bed at nighttime because I was desperate for them to never ever get divorced. And I had this like deep-seated fear that that was going to happen. And probably because children are master energy readers or whatever it is, I was sensing that there was turmoil. And certainly several years later, when I was 16 years old, my parents separated. And it was like my worst nightmare coming true. I didn't even know how to handle myself or what to do in all of that. And so I always had this fear of separation and fear of losing a parent and fear of something was going to get in the way of all of that. And then I grew up and I became a mother, got married, became a mother, and eventually divorced myself when my boys were 10 and 13 years of age. And in the lead up to that divorce, do you think that I was my grown-up adult self? Oh, no. I was my 6-year-old self, desperate for mommy and daddy to sort it out, desperate for mommy and daddy to, make it all be okay. And so these moments present themselves, I believe, not randomly in our lives so that we have an opportunity for the do-over. And as as I went through my own divorce and witnessed my children's journey and all of that, I am literally catapulted back in time to my child self's journey through all of that with my parents, and given this golden opportunity to make sense of that anew, and in the doing of that, to heal it for myself, and in real time heal it for my children, so that they then don't need to grow up and repeat the same pattern for the lesson to be learned. Right? And so, I mean, I could tell you 3,000 more examples of those kinds of things where we continue to repeat the patterns of our own childhood. And that's a very obvious pattern. Parents get divorced, you grow up, you get divorced. But there's often really subtle patterns where we're pulling the thread of the story that is family-er or familiar from our childhood, or sometimes down the family line, because we know intergenerationally that stuff can transfer through epigenetics. And at some point, we will get our heads slammed into the brick wall of life, which is the invitation to step in, come alongside the inner child, help that child to grow and feel safe, and then find your way forward from there.
Massive. Yeah, it's massive. I mean, thank you for your honesty. As I said, I think it's so good to actually just be human and be vulnerable. And I think that's how we actually can help each other and get alongside and add value. And, I know for me personally, like even this year, it was a bizarre year. It was a really strange year. And I kind of felt like I went through a bit of a dark night of the soul in just some different ways, just cognitively, mentally, some strange things were happening that I hadn't experienced before. I was kind of going, hang on, have I had anxiety for a long time and never even realized it, or never called it that, or never, there was a lot of stuff. And I really had to do some digging, some excavating, and kind of look into some stuff from the past and go, okay, well, hang on. Yeah, you actually did go through that as a child. That was really traumatic. Actually, yeah, you did go through that. That was actually really traumatic. You went through that, and I think what we do is, and especially maybe, I don't know if it's a male or female thing, it's probably both, but you know, we grow up and my whole philosophy was, no, like I'm good. Like I know that happened. I acknowledge that happened. I'm not trying to sweep it under the carpet. I acknowledge it. I've grieved over it. I grieved over it when I was young and I'm okay now. I'm fine, you know, and that's kind of, that was the stance I was taking, you know, and it's like, sometimes it's like what you said, you hit that brick wall and it's like, are you really fine? Are you really okay? And I think it's one thing to kind of have to respond, right? Because something has you've just hit a brick wall or something has gone down and it's like, no, you have to look at this now. That's one thing. But it's another thing to kind of go, well, are there some practices or can we preempt this a little bit? Can we do some, you know what I mean? Can we do some work on ourselves so that my child doesn't have to be, you know, bear the brunt of my weird outburst in 6 months or whatever it is? Like, can you kind of help us, you know, maybe with some even practical learning around that or, you know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think that there are ways to become increasingly aware of your own programming, which is another way to talk about sort of that which lurks beneath the surface, the childlike versions of ourselves that come forward. I really do believe that there's a lot that we can do to be on top of that, and I'll talk with you about that a little bit. And I also think that without challenge, there will be no growth. And so we do have to struggle. It's part of the human condition. It's part of what allows us to evolve into the fullest version of who we're intended to be in this lifetime. And so there does have to be some grindiness about it. We can't all just, you know, sunshine and roses skate through it.
Yeah.
The other piece is that the wake-up calls that we will all receive, and everybody all through the course of life, you will get wake-up calls, which is an invitation to step into your fullest potential. The wake-up calls start out quiet. And if they're ignored, they get a little louder, just like a child that you're ignoring, they get a little louder. And if they're ignored more, then they get louder. And for some of us, they will need to give loud before we're like, okay, I hear you. I'm ready to do the work, right? And so the preemptive part is to become very aware and listening for the call, so that as you're getting the little nudges along the way, you understand that it's a wake-up call. It's an invitation to grow yourself. And there's, you know, I think a lot of ways that we can go about that. I have found in my own life, having a guide who assists me in that process has been incredibly important. I spend 2 hours a week in my own therapy sessions, and I'm also part of a community that comes together once a week to talk about consciousness kinds of ideas and how that applies to our lives and to our parenting and other kinds of things. And so and I have a mentor, a teacher, and all of that who kind of leads me through those things. And so I think having a guide, somebody who really is able to make sense of the importance of relationship, the reality of child development, and the key role of consciousness in parenting is, you know, a central thing. I think really getting to have a relationship with all of those former versions of yourself is another key piece. And so there's a beautiful book written by a man named John Bradshaw. It's called Homecoming. And for anybody who's really interested in doing this work, I would strongly suggest that you read that book, where he gives you, you know, activities and meditations and other things that will allow you to develop, you know, just like we feed our bodies nutritious food every day and we exercise and we do all of these things, we also have to feed that other part of ourselves. And so developing some kind of a daily practice that alerts you to the reality of that subconscious world. Your daily practice can be a lot of different things. It could be some inner child work that you do every morning and every evening before you go to bed. Your daily practice might be that you find ways to investigate your mind. I love the work of Byron Katie in that, which she has freely available to the world on her website, thework.com, where you get to, really investigate your thoughts and turn them around. When I've been in, the darkest period of my life, which was following the divorce from my children's father, I probably worked 50 to 70 thoughts a day, where I was constantly like investigating my mind. Is it true? Is it true? Is it true? Can you know for sure it's true? What kind of feelings come up for you when you believe that it's true? Really knowing that just because we have the thought, it doesn't make it real. And also then knowing that our thoughts create our reality. And so if I get really attached to that thought and it's a stressful, disconcerting kind of thought, well, life is going to feel rather stressful and disconcerting then, isn't it? And so, doing some inner child work, being willing to explore the mind, and understanding that you do have to make a daily practice of those things in the same way that you would in any other area of your life.
Yeah, that's great. It's really great. And I think, obviously someone has to place weight on that. You do have to be intentional, right? Like there's kind of no two ways about it. I like what you said, like there has to be struggle, like struggle is part of it. And, out of the soil, out of the dirt, beautiful things bloom and grow. And I do think there's just a universal law at play with that. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Sometimes you kind of wish it wasn't like that. Can I just be Zen? Like, can I just be like levitating and just floating and just like happy and it all just comes to me? But yeah. I think you're right. Like sometimes you actually have to have those moments in order to have the growth.
Yeah. Well, a very dear friend of mine, when I was, early on in my own personal growth work, said to me, I'd love to show you the way. And I just love you too much to do that. So there is something about, having to just sink into it. And I think that really well and truly is the gift of parenthood, because I haven't yet met a parent who is like, oh, it's a breeze. I haven't had like any hiccups. I've had no cause for, introspection and like freaking out about all, like I've never met in 20 years of doing this work. I have never met a parent who was like, yeah, it's cool. I got it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so it's a big invitation.
You'd be worried, right? They'd be delusional.
Yeah. I'd want to like shake them like a snow globe, like really? Because I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I guess like this, I'm loving this conversation, and there's so many different, tacks that we could take. I kind of want to talk a little bit about that whole idea of connection. And I think I'm kind of flipping it right now, because personally, I can talk about that self-work all day. Like that is such a huge issue and a big topic that I'm really fascinated in terms of ourselves as individuals and doing that excavation. And I think there's so much in it. So, I mean, but I kind of think let's just flip it for a second and talk a little bit about the connection between, a parent and their child, and really that whole philosophy of like, to be honest with you, candidly, I didn't know that much about the whole idea of attachment parenting, right? And when I started looking into it, I was kind of like, okay, there's kind of some interesting, there's different people saying different things. And then you find, I found a quote from, I'm not sure who it was, a psychologist, I think in the States. And he basically said something along the lines of, look, it's not meant to be a set of tricks, like an A plus B equals C. That's not what it is. It's actually kind of, and I think this is what you're saying, it's grounded in connection. Like this is actually ultimately what it is all about. Right. Can we kind of explore that for a little bit and talk, maybe how we cultivate that or what that really means?
Yeah. And, really when we go the route of tricks, we're divorcing ourselves from our humanity. And so it is about, I was reading an article just the other day where somebody was laying out the how ridiculous it is that we use this word parenting, because we don't talk about being in relationship with our friends and friending, and we don't talk about being with our spouse and wifing or husbanding. we don't talk about, being children of our own parents and childing. And yet we've come up with this term parenting, which somehow pulls us away from the concept that it is a relationship.
Wow.
And so, the science around it is really fascinating. And dating back to the 1940s, when John Bowlby, who we call the father of attachment, Sir John Bowlby, was really developing the theory of attachment. And then a lot of really, fascinating studies and research, and it's all still going on even to this day. And what he was able to show us was that concept of proximity, closeness in the parent-child relationship is really important. And he sort of uncovered that it is the universal need of all children everywhere, that they must have that proximity to their big people, or they're not okay. And we've got all sorts of, horrific examples from our history, the Nazi baby factories, where the death rates in those babies that didn't have relationships with big people who cared about them and loved on them. They were fed on schedules, and yes, they were housed and sheltered, but they weren't loved. And so they died en masse.
Wow.
One of my
really, I didn't know that. So I wasn't aware of that. So so they literally they were fed, they were kind of like given the tools to keep on living, but they still died without life. Is that what you're saying?
That's what it is.
Wow.
And so the Nazis were trying to cultivate an army, grow soldiers. And so they had these baby factories, and we know that those babies, the majority of them, that I don't know the exact percentage, but it's up in like the 70s kind of percentage wise. It's a lot of babies that died. And so we know that there's something about that relationship. We look at children that have come out of, atrocious kind of orphanage situations. The Romanian orphans are an example of that, where there were a lot of children in very subpar situations getting their physical needs met, but not their emotional needs. They weren't being loved on. And then we go forward, and there's, just so much more research around the key role of that relationship, and that it's not just physical contact and closeness that is the thing that the child needs, but rather it's emotional contact and closeness. And so when I work with children who are grieving the death of a parent, we're working on continuing to cultivate the experience of emotional closeness, because that's what they need more than anything. And so when we make sense of all of that, we actually understand that the relationship the child has with their big person is valued in terms of, sometimes we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and at the base is our physical needs and so on and so forth. But the reality is that children will seek out the relationship above and beyond food. It's so important to them. They would actually sacrifice being fed if it meant getting to be loved. And so we have witnessed, in all of these different circumstances, babies who develop a condition called failure to thrive and die in the absence of love. So we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that this is what makes a child's world go round. The relationship is key. Then you fast forward to modern day parenting, well, pseudo modern day parenting. And somewhere around the 1950s, there was a very big shift in the dominant pop culture of child raising, which kind of became quite focused on the facade of the behavior and the facade of the child, and placed value on that above all else. And so if the child wasn't behaving in a way that made us feel good, in a way that was convenient, in a way that suited our schedule, if the child wasn't behaving, we realized we could kind of do all of these things, and magically we would get the results that we wanted. And so, if a child isn't sleeping, you just leave them to cry. Magically, what happens? They start sleeping. Well, pat on the back. That must work then, right? Or if a child is, acting out towards a sibling, or not performing well at school. Then we punish them somehow. We take something they love away from them. Maybe we smack them. Maybe we, whatever we do. And solution. Now they're behaving better. And so pat ourselves on the back. That must work, right? But what we didn't get is that the reason those things were so-called working in terms of getting rid of the behaviors is that it was at the expense of the child being able to experience the relationship unconditionally. So it was the ultimate sacrificial play, where you took the relationship that you were having with the child, which is, remember, their most important need. And they will serve that need above everything else, including their own developmental needs. And so you take the relationship that you have with the child and you put it on the line in order to serve good behavior. And what is good behavior anyways? Like, at what point did we conflate morality with child development? I mean, it's a ludicrous thing, but we all, how often do you hear that phrase? Good boy, good girl, right? We use it all the time. And so this is what happened. We began to use these behavioral strategies from a behaviorist school of thought. And what we didn't understand was that we were sacrificing the greatest need of the child underneath all of that.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge. And it's challenging. That's going to challenge a lot of people. And I'm sure you're very used to that. I'm sure you're very used to having, like popular awkward kind of conversations and, right. interviews. And I think that's good. I think that's good. I think it's good to be challenged. And I think, and what I want to kind of unpack a little bit there is that idea that it's not a set of tricks. So when we talk about, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, what you're saying is, okay, yes, we know that, take breastfeeding, right? Something that I'm not, that familiar with, but take breastfeeding. We all know that it's intrinsically very powerful, create a connection, a human bond takes place in that moment. Like, it's good physically, the milk that they're getting, like all that stuff. We know that, right? But what about the mum who isn't producing any milk and can't breastfeed her baby? Does that then suddenly, they don't have you're a bad mum, you don't have the connection? I don't think that's what you're saying. You're actually specifying it's the emotional connection that trumps kind of the physical tasks, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are so many channels in for that emotional connection to be laid down with beautiful deep roots that allow that tree, that plant to go forward and bear fruit. And so we have to understand that when we get very attached to the form of this, that's what's divorcing us from our humanity. Yeah. We have to release our attachment to form and outcome and understand that it is about the being within us. And I love, Eckhart Tolle has this gorgeous quote, which if I could remember it, I would share it with you now, but I'll give you the Coles Notes version of it, where he basically says, the doing flows from the being. And so when I wrote my first book, I developed this 3-part mantra that was see it, then feel it, then be it. And the reason that I landed on this mantra, which I have shared with parents for years and years and years, is that the number one question that I get asked as a child psychologist is, what do I do when? What do I do when my kid this? What do I do when I can't breastfeed and I'm going to rob my child of this opportunity to be deeply bonded to me? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And the honest to goodness answer is, with 13 years of post-secondary education under my belt, I've been child raising myself now for almost 17 years. I've been out in the field of the practice of psychology for almost 20 years now. And if you ask me what to do, I have no idea. Like, good luck. And that'll be $300. And the reason that I don't know what to do is because that's not my child. And I'm not you. And I'm not in your home. I don't know what happened at your dinner table last night. I don't know that your family dog died 2 months ago. I don't know the ongoing conflict that you have with your own mother. I don't know any of those things. So I don't know, like, Good luck.
Mm.
And the issue is that it's the wrong question. The question ought not to be, what do I do when, but rather, how do I be? How
Mm.
do I be when
Mm.
my child is upset?
Mm.
How do I be in this moment where I'm uncertain of what's the right decision to make for my
Mm.
child medically or educationally or whatever? How do I be in all of that? Because when you get the being, all of this stuff sorted out, the doing flows from the being. And that's
Mm.
why we don't need tricks. And, you know, if we put it into adult terms, like imagine your best friend shows up on your doorstep tonight, sobbing inconsolably with grief. Do you think to yourself, okay, hold on, I just read that book about how to comfort grief stricken friends. Let me run into my living room and remind myself of the 3-step strategy, right? And if you were to do that and actually, you know, employ that with your friend on your front step tonight, your friend is going to be like, are you crackers? Like, what are you doing? Right?
Yeah.
Our children are the same.
Mm.
When we get all weird and read all the weird parenting books and then, you know, have to do all the weird like behavioral control techniques, our kids are like, wait, what? Are you supposed to be in charge here? Like, what are you doing, you weirdo? Right? And then they intrinsically begin to not trust us.
Mm.
And the whole thing with the relationship being everything, we need for them, so the relationship invites them to lean in on us. And when they're leaning on us, metaphorically, we have this point of contact, connection with them. So when I go here, they follow me. If I go here, because we're connected, they follow me.
Mm.
And so when we invite the lean in, we get to be ultimately in the lead of them. They want to
Mm.
do our bidding because they kind of like us and they
Mm.
trust us. They
Mm.
trust us to hold their heart in our hands and to keep that safe. When you get all weird and tricks and strategies oriented, your kids are responding to you exactly the same way that that grief-stricken friend would be responding to you were you to employ those kinds of, you know, manualized responses to them. So we have to step away from that. Having said that, yeah, like figure out a little bit about child development. That's
Mm.
cool. Do that because that'll help you understand and make sense of your kid. And don't be weird. That's going to be in my next book. The key to successful parenting, don't be weird.
Yeah, that's going to be hard.
Mm, I know.
No, I love that. I mean, let's talk a little bit further about that. Like in terms of, okay, the person that says, okay, but am I meant to be an authority or a friend or both, or what's the difference? Like, you know what I mean? What do you say about that?
Yeah, there is a hierarchical order to the parent-child relationship. So the parent is here, or the big person, be a teacher, be a caregiver, whatever your role is. The big person is here and the child is here. And not in a gross, yucky way.
Mm.
This is in a nurturing, compassionate way. Because kids are looking around, and the natural order of things is that we are meant to be in the lead of them.
Mm.
They are meant to rest into our care so that they don't have to tell us how to do it by getting louder with their behaviors and louder with their upset. They're meant to rest into our care. And when they can rest into our care, then they are released to the developmental process. But if they have to redirect all their energy to being like, hello, I am not okay over here. How many other ways do I have to tell you that I'm not okay over here? Then they have to redirect energy to managing the relationship rather than being able to go and grow. When you are present at the birth of a newborn babe, you watch them. They can't see very much, and usually they have their eyes closed at first. And then they start to get their little eyes cracked open. And again, they can't see very well. They can see a perfect distance of 12 inches. That's you holding them right there. And they'll start to look around, and they might catch a light and be distracted by that. And they look around, and then they find your eyes. And they're like, oh, there you are. I mean, they can be moments old, but they know you are their best bet because you're here and they're there. And they're counting on you to show up and get this right for them. And what happens to you? Do you remember this experience with your own children when their eyes landed on yours
Yeah,
the first time?
yeah, yeah.
What happened inside?
I mean, it's the highest. It's the height of the human experience. That's what I'd
Whew,
say about it.
right. And there's this instantaneous like swell. Like you decide in that very moment that you will leap tall buildings in a single bound and jump in front of moving trains for this kid
Mm-hmm.
because they looked at you.
Yeah.
That's the power of it, right? And they know to find you because you are their best bet. So there is a hierarchical order to that. There is a big person in the lead. And if you ever talk to people who are doing end of life care for their own parents, how uncomfortable that is for them, it's uncomfortable because this has happened.
Hmm.
And now the child is in the lead and they want no part of it. Even if they're 55 years old, they want no part of it.
Wow.
My eldest son contracted meningitis when he was 8 years old. Who did I call? My first call from the hospital? My mom. Because the order is always there, that she's my big person. I go back to her. And so there is an order to it. And I'm not saying that then you get to be, not kind to your kids, because people in charge are always kind. You ask my boys, they know that that's one of the golden rules of life. People in charge are always kind. And so it's not that we then have free license to be horrible, but rather that the responsibility then is upon us to lead with compassion, to find a way to navigate all of this with firmness and with kindness in equal measure.
Well said. It's very, very, very powerful. What is kind of inspiring you right now? What do you get inspired about? What are you kind of excited about in this area?
Yeah. Well, my partner and I developed this course, Parenting 2.0, a couple of years ago. And what's incredible about that is you can never take somebody where you haven't taken yourself. And he and I have both been on, really interesting journeys, as we all have been, and putting the pieces of that together to make sense of our own paths and also to help others understand their path. And so it's an incredible thing to be sharing that with the world and getting to hear about how it's transforming lives. I really, as I'm on this side of 45 now, so I'm like, zooming along to 50, and I think about how wonderfully freeing it is in this stage of my life to get to show up and do my professional work very authentically as who I am in my real life. And, I joke about when I was a brand new psychologist, I was really kind of like, it has to go this way and I must be like this and la la la, and well, that didn't work out. And so now I just like walk out on stage naked all the time. I mean, not really, but yeah. It's a wonderful thing to live authentically as who you are, to be free to be who you are really meant to be, and to be getting to bring that into my work right now with the teaching that we're doing. We've already sort of put together the outline and ideas that will be in our book on divorce, given that 60% of the population is experiencing that. So, and how we can, really make sure that we do the best job we can with ourselves as big people, so our kids get the best possible shot.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, that sounds really exciting. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's, that whole thing around divorce, it's like, oh yeah, you could be idealistic and just say, oh, don't get divorced, but that's not the world we live in, So actually to create the tools and to create, a resource for people to actually find strength and healing and empower, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I hope so.
I just want to ask one quick question. I think we're getting to the end of our time now, and I could talk all day with you because this has been amazing. So thank you again. But what do you think is the difference, and could you break down the difference between what you would call emotional health and what you would call mental health? Because I feel like those two terms, practically speaking, like mental health is talked about so much in society today. We understand, that to a degree, and emotional health. Like, how do you see those two, and how do you kind of break that down for
Mm-hmm.
people?
I mean, I guess because I'm a psychologist and I diagnose people, I've done that my whole career, not without trepidation. And so being part of that world of mental health, for me, that is almost that I often talk about big T truths and little T truths. And the little T truths are the things that are, fed by the ego, fed by fear, don't really necessarily serve us well, especially when we get attached to the story around all of that. And the big T truths are the things that set us free. The big T truths are when we really get who it is that we actually are, when we can understand to the fullest non-limits of our limits, our core truths. So when I hear, the mental health thing, I think small T truth.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear emotional health, I think big T truth. And it's not that I'm saying anxiety is not real or depression's not real. I mean, oh my gosh, I see people struggling with those things all the time. And I have struggled in my own life at times with some of those pieces. And so I know those experiences to be real. And I know diagnostically how to, get people to fit categories in order to serve the systems that we all live and work in. I really get all of that. And when we feed the wolf of fear around all of that mental health stuff, we actually perpetuate it. When we feed the wolf of hope, the wolf of love, that will be the wolf that grows. And so it takes me back to that core piece of emotional health. Well, where is it that we learned to be anxious? And if we could focus on emotional health and well-being of ourselves, of and for our children, and even on down the family line, how might then we change the landscape in terms of mental health?
Yeah.
And so I see them kind of, they coexist and they intersect. And one is driven by an internalization of pathology, and the other is driven by a real acknowledgement of the power, the strength, the resilience of the human spirit, and what it is that we can do as big people for our littles, so that that's what gets to emerge and come forth, rather than the burdensome toll of that mental health side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's amazing. And I think, from what I'm hearing about that, you're basically just saying, to a degree, you're talking about emotional health as being that, what did you say, 50 bit per second? Or, the thing that by far trumped the conscious thinking was the subconscious programming in there, and what's going on deep within your soul.
Yeah, that's it. Look at you, said that in one sentence. That took me like 12 minutes of talking.
Yeah, but that's because I was able to process what you were saying, so it would have taken me a while if I hadn't had you. Well, look, thank you so much. I mean, I love this, and as I said, I could go on all day. I'm mindful of your time, and I feel like maybe somewhere down the line we can have another conversation and pick up where we left off.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me on and for shining light out there in the world for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing all that you guys are doing next, and stay warm over there in Canada, and hopefully at some point, we can get over there for a visit. I've always wanted to go there. It looks so beautiful.
Well, you come. We'll show you all around.
That'd be amazing. All right. Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye for now.